Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. Okay, so I wanted to start off this episode with a little quiz. Well, quizzes are no fun. Let's just think of it as a game. And don't worry about winning or losing. You're all winners in my book, dear listeners. Friends, if I may be so bold. So, here it goes. I'm going to describe a movie to you, and you guess what movie it is. Pretty simple, all things considered. And don't worry, this isn't some insanely deep cut that virtually no one has ever seen, like Sizzle Beach USA or Chopper Chicks in Zombie Town. Fun fact, both distributed by the one and only Troma Entertainment, the greatest film company in the world, and star Kevin Costner and Billy Bob Thornton, respectively. But the film I am describing is very much in the mainstream and, in fact, won 5 Academy Awards. So, ready? Let's play. A world-renowned forensic psychiatrist takes pity on a young female FBI trainee who suffered not only unwelcome, unwanted, and frankly unprofessional verbal and sexual harassment in the course of doing her job, but also sexual assault. He agrees to take her under his wing and help her bust one of the most horrific serial killers of all time. Not only does he make good on his promise, but along the way, he also teaches her part of his craft, how he can get in the head of a serial killer, which she can in turn bring even more serial killers to justice. Despite all of this, she still tries to take part in having him wrongly arrested. Using his incredible cunning, he is able to escape, but is forced to leave the country. The movie ends with them on a phone call where she tells him that she will never stop hunting him. And even though he's disappointed to hear this, he is not only able to accept it, even though it means he may never be able to return to his homeland, but he also decides he will bring justice to the man who verbally harassed her. So, what do you think it is? Well, here's the answer. The 1991 classic, Silence of the Lambs, starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. Now, whether you won, lost, or drawled, whether you won or lost, which was really the only two options anyway, you may have noticed that the game wasn't that fair. You might be saying to yourself that summary is oddly sympathetic to someone who is well known to be a monster. And also, some of those descriptions range from willing misrepresentations of the truth to outright lies at best. And you know what? You're absolutely right. That's because it was told from Hannibal Lecter's point of view. To that, you may say, well, that explains the sympathy for the monster, but what of the lies? To which I would say simply, well, Hannibal Lecter's a fucking liar. He lies. But you already knew that. But alas, this episode is not about Silence of the Lambs, and if I'm being completely honest, we probably won't ever have one on that particular film. So this seems as good a place as any to say I am aware that there's some debate over how well certain elements of that movie have aged. Not enough for me to do a whole episode on, but if you want to hear two women much smarter than I discuss it, which really, why wouldn't you, may I humbly direct you to the YouTube video essays J.K. Rowling by ContraPoints and Tracing the Roots of Pop Culture Transphobia by Lindsay Ellis. Don't worry about writing it down. The links will be in the show notes. Now, granted, both of these talk about the film as a smaller element of a much bigger discussion, and both videos are quite long, coming in at about an hour and a half and an hour respectively. But both videos are fantastic, as timely as ever, and there are certainly worse ways to spend your time, like, I don't know, off the top of my head, playing an anti-Semitic wizarding video game that serves to give more money and influence and power to a turf hell-bent on sending trans folk back decades. You know, if I were to just think of one off the top of my head. And lest you think this is me virtue signaling, let me assure you, it absolutely is. Band Media Podcast is a friend of trans folks and stands behind their fight for basic human dignity 100%, because that's the right thing to do. but you already knew that. So enough about Silence of the Lambs and onward with the actual subject of this episode. Vladimir Nabokov's novel, Lolita, and the films that followed it. But before we go any further, we should probably jump into this week's trigger warnings. We will be discussing child sex abuse, rape, and mental illness. There have been many covers to grace the binding of Nabokov's masterpiece, and arguably one of the best covers has the following blurb on it. A blurb that has seemed to follow the story across the many editions throughout the decades. Quote, "The only convincing love story of our century," end quote, by none other than Vanity Fair. That is incorrect. Regardless of the greatness of the very many love stories told in that century, Lolita can't be on that list because Lolita isn't a love story. There's a 10-episode podcast aptly titled Lolita Podcast, link in the show notes, that I leaned on quite a bit for this episode. The lovely host, Jamie Loftus, gives the following summary of the book. And while I doubt that you will find this on the inside sleeve of any edition, it is by far the most accurate summary I have ever heard. Quote, "A middle-aged European pedophile named Humbert falls in love with," heavy quotes there, "then abducts and sexually and psychologically abuses 12-year-old American girl Dolores Hayes, or Lolita, then abducts and rapes her across the U.S. in the late 1940s, end quote. She goes on to say, quote, "Lolita tells the story of a pedophile who abuses a 12-year-old that he is supposed to be taking care of," end quote. There is this air around the story that it is a misunderstood love story, or even worse, a tale of a grown man who fell victim to the sexual charms of an underage girl. The folks who have heard that narrative may make the argument that previous description is maybe biased or pushing some form of agenda or purposely framing things in the worst possible light. But I believe the foreword of the novel backs up this interpretation. The foreword of this story is written by fictional John Ray Jr., Ph.D., in which he explains that the following manuscript, which you are about to read, is titled Lolita, or Confessions of a White Widowed Male. And the manuscript was written by a man who had just passed away in jail from heart failure while awaiting his trial. Dr. Ray had received this manuscript from its author's lawyer and was told only to publish it after its author's death. Dr. Ray, who informs us that all of the names have been changed with the exception of Lolita's, though her last name is changed. And the manuscript is unchanged from how he received it, except for a few places where he made location less identifiable. You know, the whole old Dragnet bit. Ladies and gentlemen, the story you're about to hear is true, only the names have been changed to protect the innocent. But Doc Ray also gives us warning in no uncertain terms that despite the fact that he believes this book will become a classic in psychiatric circles for its insights into Humbert, you know, the aforementioned European pedophile, that the man himself is, quote, no gentleman, end quote. And though Humbert employs some undeniably just real purty words, I'm paraphrasing, of course, it is not to be forgotten that he is a, quote, demented diarist, end quote, and, quote, a shining example of moral leprosy, end quote. These are only a couple of the not-so-kind expressions that Dr. Ray uses to describe our not-so-humble narrator, Humbert. From there, Humbert starts in with what is legitimately some of the most beautiful, sophisticated prose in the English language, made all the more impressive by the fact that Nabokov was Russian. But it is Humbert himself that lays out the fact not only did he indeed murder a man, but his purpose in writing the book is to show that it was not his fault. He does this by first telling the story of his life before he met Lolita. How when he was young, he fell in love with another child of 12 named Annabelle Lee, And before they could bang, she died of typhus, suggesting maybe that's where he gets his thing for 12-year-olds. As he grows older, he also starts to frequently partake in the company of prostitutes, which is fine. Sex work is real work. But he finds himself mostly attracted to what he calls nymphettes, whose age ranges from 9 to 14, which is not fine and gross. There's a long list of traits that make a nymphette, but they mostly boil down to, dude, you can tell she wants it, which is wrong at any age, but especially for minors. And again, gross. He also spends a suspicious amount of time reassuring everybody reading the book that he is like super handsome. Like an oddly large amount of time talking about how handsome he is. He gets married in hopes of not banging child prostitutes anymore, but is extremely cruel to his wife and treats her with indifference until she leaves him for another man, and he goes into a rage where he contemplates murdering her. He also spends time in and out of several sanitariums, where he boasts about being just so damn smart that he could manipulate the psychiatrist into thinking he was perfectly fine. Now, not only does this lead us to the end of Humbert Humbert's life and times before Lolita, it also brings us to a very uncomfortable point that I don't think anybody likes talking about, but I think is important. So let's just dip our toes in the shallow end at first and start with some definitions. First, the difference between pedophilia and hebephilia. Pedophilia is defined as a psychiatric disorder in which an adult or older adolescent experiences a primary or exclusive sexual attraction to prepubescent children. Although girls typically begin the process of puberty at age 10 or 11 and boys at age 11 or 12, the criteria for pedophilia has a cutoff point for prepubescence at age 13. Whereas hebephilia is defined as a strong, persistent sexual interest by adults in prepubescent children in their early adolescence, typically ages 11 to 14. So for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to use the term pedophilia, not only because Lolita is within the overlap of those groups, but more important, it's just the common parlance for when we want to say an adult attracted to children. And here comes our last definition. Child sexual abuse, which is defined as an adult or older adolescent using children for sexual stimulation. All of this is to say that pedophiles have sexual urges towards children, and child sex abusers act on those urges. And while the words in the definition might not seem so different, those two things are worlds apart. It is important to keep in mind that pedophilia is a mental disorder listed in the DSM-5 and everything. The actual attraction itself, the feelings or compulsions on their own, are not the issue. Where it becomes a big problem is when someone acts on them. Humbert not only acts on them repeatedly, he does so without remorse or any intention to seek help. In fact, when help is forced on him, he not only manipulates his way out of it, but openly mocks it. All of this is to say, Humbert is a bad guy and should be recognized as such. But it is important that in our zealousness to protect children from sexual abuse, an obviously good thing to do, we can't throw people with mental disorders such as this under the bus. And if you or somebody you know are affected with this disorder, please seek help. Not only for your sake, but more importantly, for that of any potential victims. I can't even imagine how difficult it would be to have to go out and admit this to someone, but luckily there's help. There's an organization aptly called Before You Act, and if you go to their website, the letter B, the number 4, the letter U, act.org, that's beforeyouact.org, again, link in the show notes, you can anonymously search for resources, support groups. They can even help you get connected with a therapist that can help. So with all of that noted, going forward on this podcast, we will be referring to Humbert as what he actually is, a child sexual abuser, or CSA for short. And probably, if I'm being honest, I'll maybe refer to him as a piece of shit from time to time. Now, before we meet Dolores Hayes, that's right, friends, Lolita isn't even her fucking name, let's take a look at the life and times of the man who brought this novel to life. Vladimir Vladimirovich Nabokov, my personal nomination for most Russian name ever, was born in 1899, unsurprisingly, in Russia. He was the oldest of 5 children in a wealthy, prominent family of Russian nobility. His father, Vladimir Dmitrovich Nabokov, my personal recommendation for runner-up for most Russian name ever, was a liberal lawyer and politician who was notably regarded as one of the most outspoken advocates for Jewish rights and against anti-Semitic laws in the Russian Empire. Also, a passionate opponent of the death penalty. His mother was heiress Yelena Ivanovna Nie Rukavishnikova. My personal recommendation for the end of this joke, the granddaughter of a millionaire gold mine owner. After the events of the February Revolution, fun fact, Russia was still on the Julian calendar at that time. Today, in most of the world, we use the Gregorian calendar. Russia would make the switch the following year in 1918 when it jumped from January 13th to February 14th. But this means that the February Revolution actually took place in what is now considered March 8th. Anyway, after the February Revolution, Nabokov's father became a secretary of the Russian Provisional Government in St. Petersburg. Sounds like a good place to be, but history buffs will tell you that provisional government was not exactly the longest lasting government in the world. Later that same year came the October Revolution, which legitimately happened in October of both calendars, also known as the Bolshevik Revolution, wherein Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party would lead an armed insurrection against the Russian Provisional Government, causing the Nabokovs to flee to the safety of Crimea. They would later flee to England and then Berlin. Sadly, the Nabokovs would never really escape political turmoil. Vladimir's father was murdered in 1922 when 2 anti-Semitical activists and future Nazis tried to assassinate Pavel Milyukov. When they opened fire on Milyukov, Nabokov wrestled the gunman to the floor, where he was shot twice and died instantly. It should be noted that Nabokov's final act saved the life of Milyukov and prevented him from being murdered by the assassins, both of which were convicted of murder and sentenced to a measly 14 years, of which they would only serve a fraction because of the German government's more lenient stance on right-wing terrorists at the time. In 1940, Vladimir's younger brother, Sergei, was living in Paris and using his mastery of the German language to work as a translator in Berlin. Sergei was in fact a homosexual who at the time had a lover. They did their best to keep it under wraps, but the Gestapo found out and arrested him in 1941 on charges of homosexuality. 5 months later, he was let free from jail due to the lack of evidence and the help from his lawyer cousin. Do remember the Nabokovs were a connected family. After this incident, Sergei began to more openly criticize the Nazis. On November 24th, 1943, Sergei was arrested again, and this time he was sent to a concentration camp, where on January 9th, 1945, he died of dysentery and starvation. To this day, the exact official reason for his second arrest is unknown. By this time, Vladimir Nabokov had found himself in America. Along the way, he had met a Russian Jewish woman by the name of Vera Estevan Slonim, and the two had married, having one child, a son by the name of Dmitry. In 1940, they were living in France when they fled for America as the German troops were approaching. By this time, keep in mind, he had already published many novels, novellas, collections of short stories, and poetry in his native Russian, despite the fact that growing up, Russian, English, and French were all spoken fluently in the Nabokov household. Fun fact, while in Cambridge, while studying Slavic and other Romance languages, Vladimir also studied zoology, where he managed to become quite the lepidopterist, which is someone who studies butterflies. Motherfucker really loved his butterflies. In fact, he wrote a good part of Lolita and other novels while traveling on butterfly collecting expeditions that he took during the summer in the western United States. During his time in the U.S., which was from 1940 to 1961, Nabokov was primarily a professor of Russian and European literature at Wesley College, a private women's liberal arts college in Wesley, Massachusetts, and then later at Cornell University, a private Ivy League in New York. Fun fact, it was while he was teaching at Cornell that one of his students would be none other than the notorious RBG herself, the future U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She would later claim Nabokov as a major influence in her own writing. Although released in 1955, by 1961 it became apparent that the financial success of Lolita would allow Nabokov to retire from teaching and move back to Europe, taking up residency in Montreal, Switzerland, where he continued to write until his death on July 2nd, 1977, at the age of 78. So back to his infamous novel, Lolita. As we go forward, you may notice some similarities between Nabokov and Humbert, or things that Nabokov pulled from his real life as artistic inspiration for the novel. Though I do think it should be noted, noticeably not in that category of similarities, is child sexual assault or sexual assault in general, or pedophilia. Nabokov was far from perfect. He had, let's say, problematic views of women writers in general, and that was being gracious. For instance, he once said of Jane Austen, quote, "I dislike Jane Austen and am prejudiced, in fact, against all women writers. They are in another class," end quote, but would later go on to teach Austen's novel in his literature course, and would call Marina Tsvetaeva a, quote, "poet of genius," end quote. So not the most consistent, but even given all of that, it can be said that he shared none of the traits that made Humbert a monster. So after we spent a few chapters getting to know Humbert, we dive into the meat of the story. Humbert has just moved to Ramsdale, a small town in New England, where he can work on the book that he is writing. He needs a place to stay, so he decides to rent a room. Enter Charlotte Hayes, a widower with a room to rent. At first, Humbert is completely uninterested until he sees Charlotte's daughter, none other than 12-year-old Dolores Hayes, Lolita being the weird pet name that he made up for her. To quote the first words of chapter 1, quote, "Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, Lolita, the tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. She was low, plain low in the morning, standing 4'10" in one sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms, she was always Lolita," end quote. My hope here is that hearing this in my voice instead of a debonair sultriness of Jeremy Irons, who plays Humbert in the 1997 film and narrated the audiobook, it will emphasize that this is a gross thing to say. And I hope that you felt as dirty hearing it as I did saying it, and not in a good way. And so he falls in love with Dolores, or should I say Lolita, which is his idolized nymphette version of Dolores. Especially through the beginning of the novel, we hardly actually hear from the real Dolores. He describes his first sexual encounter with her with increasingly beautiful and symbolic language as the chapter plays out, creating this abstract concoction of primal human desires and passions with a biblical purity of Lolita's innocence that he strives to maintain even in the face of his overwhelming lust. When in actuality what happened, if you take a step back, is Humbert play wrestled with Dolores over a magazine, and then when they stopped, she spread out over the couch and laid her legs across his lap. He used the opportunity to masturbate himself by rubbing his hard cock against her legs until he came, all without her even noticing. A fact he spends quite a bit of time patting himself on the back about, even though later it is revealed that she probably did know the whole time. Humbert soon comes to see that Dolores and Charlotte have a shaky relationship, which, to be fair, shouldn't come as that much of a surprise. Teens and preteens are notorious for driving their parents crazy, and Charlotte is a single mom and a widower trying to stay afloat by renting out a room in her house to a stranger in the 1940s. This is not what anybody would call a dream situation, despite the fact that she is in an impossible situation and that she treats him with the utmost kindness. Not only because she's generally a kind person who just happens to be struggling with her daughter, but also because she clearly has a crush on Humbert. He has nothing but disdain for her that he hides behind his foreign charms. As the tension between mother and daughter keeps building, Charlotte sends Dolores away to a camp for summer. Though before Dolores leaves, she plants a big sloppy kiss on Humbert. When Charlotte leaves, taking Dolores with her to summer camp, Humbert does what any normal, rational human would do and hurriedly makes his way to Dolores' room and begins forging through her underwear. It should also be noted that his first plan, though he does drop it quickly, is to pull a reverse Miss Doubtfire and dress up as a young woman and follow Dolores to camp. His one-man panty raid is cut short, though, when he hears the maid call out for him. She gives him a letter from Charlotte. The letter, which, as a side note, is written in prose suspiciously similar to Humbert's own, and not at all what you would expect from the ignorant cow that Humbert has described, pours out her love for him and that she just couldn't take being there alone with him if her feelings were unrequited. So he has two choices: pack up and leave before she gets home, or, what she most desires, stay and marry her and be a dad to Lolita. He decides to stay and marry Charlotte so that he can work his way even closer to Dolores because he is gross. Humbert spends a good amount of time faking insomnia to get different sedatives from his doctor that he uses to secretly drug Charlotte so she will fall asleep and he doesn't have to have sex with her. Oh, young love. So his plan of continuing to gaslight Charlotte until her daughter returns home so he can molest her some more goes relatively well, until Charlotte finds his journal, where she finds not only does this motherfucker hate her, but is planning to have sex with her daughter. She calls him a monster. He politely informs her that she is hallucinating, but she's not going to take it. Not this time. She storms off with 3 letters in her hand. Probably not good news for Humbert. He rushes to the kitchen to pour a scotch, but while there, he gets a call from the gardener next door, and it seems that Charlotte has been run over by a car. It seems that in the very short time he was in the kitchen, Charlotte had run out of the house in hysterics, run into the street without looking, and been struck dead by a car. This is either awfully convenient for Humbert, or maybe, just maybe, he had a hand in it. Such are the downfalls of an unreliable narrator. So he picks up Dolores and begins his cross-country sexcapades with a 12-year-old, the majority of which he spends waxing poetic about his Lolita, but being completely apathetic towards and even spiteful of the actual human being that is Dolores Hayes. And don't worry, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, I will not spoil the entire plot of the book for you. But I did want you to at least get a gist of what's going on here. Don't let my disdain for the character of Humbert, a character I believe you are supposed to disdain, be confused with disdain for the book, which in a lot of ways is this amazingly eloquently written peek inside the mind of a morally bankrupt and vile human being, and the human destruction that he leaves in his wake. But, and this is a Sir Mix-a-Lot sized but, if you are taken in by Humbert's eloquence, if you end up believing that, in his words, quote, empathetically, No killers are we. Poets never kill. End quote. And that this harm is somehow justified by his impassioned pining and soliloquies of misunderstood lust, then the point of the book quickly moves from a warning of the type of everyday monster that existed and still exists among us in frighteningly high numbers to a pornographic manifesto made specifically for that very monster. And believe me, nobody longs to put the words pornographic and manifesto together more than me, but that has to involve people aged 18 or over when it comes to real life humans. This pornographic view of the book, which again, I remind you, I have nothing against pornography and sex work is real work, but nonetheless, this view of Dolores as a young woman who is quite literally terrorized by the person who is in charge of protecting her as being Lolita, or as Humbert puts it, some kind of nymphette, an underage succubus using her feminine wiles to seduce older men's hidden yet for some reason justified longing for children, has managed to take over the social understanding of the book. Nabokov himself almost published the book under an alias because of this very subject matter. When he originally tried to sell the book, the manuscript was turned down by an array of American publishers. He finally managed to get the book published in France by Olympia Press. What Nabokov did not know at the time was that Olympia Press's publications were about 3/4 pornography. Nonetheless, the run of 5,000 copies of Lolita sold out. It would even eventually get reviewed, like Graham Greene in the London Sunday Times, who called it one of the best 3 books of the year. And at the other end of the spectrum, there was John Gordon of the London Sunday Express that called it, quote, sheer unrestrained pornography, end quote. Unfortunately, orders were given to British custom officers to seize all copies entering the United Kingdom. Not to be outdone, France banned Lolita. The ban lasted for about 2 years. When the British finally did get around to publishing the book in 1959, it was so controversial that it ended up playing a role in the downfall of Member of Parliament, not the Funkadelic one, Nigel Nicholson, because he was a partner at Whitfield and Nicholson, who published the book. The book was finally published in the US in 1958 by G.P. Putnam's Sons and became the first book since Gone with the Wind to sell 100,000 copies in the first 3 weeks. If you remember correctly, Gone with the Wind is the book that actually sympathizes with its content, in this case racism, and the folks who fought to uphold slavery, but I digress. However, if you would like to hear more about my admittedly uneducated thoughts about Gone with the Wind, I've never read the book or seen the movie, but feel free to check out episode 8 of this very podcast, Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, a fan favorite. And by fan favorite, I mean my friend Mark. It's one of his favorite. The notoriety of the novel not only led to our man Nabokov being able to become a full-time writer and ditch the teaching gig, but also led to the book being adapted into a film, not once, but twice. It should be noted that there have been a ton of derivative literary works, stage plays, and even a couple of failed musical adaptations about the book. But the 2 adaptations that definitely held the most cultural significance are the 1962 film by Stanley Kubrick and the 1997 film by Adrian Lyne, both titled Lolita. Kubrick faced a pretty large challenge when he decided to take on Lolita. This was still the era of the Hays Code, which kept strict rules for the internal censorship of movies. Rules that the very subject matter of the film stood in stark contrast to. This was such a dilemma, it was even used as a tagline for the film, quote, "How did they ever make a movie of Lolita?" End quote. And the answer is, they kind of didn't. Kubrick made his Lolita a comedy. That was, at least on the surface, their way of skirting the Hays Code. His film is at best a satirical jab at the society that would let a person like Humbert do his thing. Which, to be clear, his thing in this movie is only hinted at through double entendres as anything sexual. but that is an admittedly generous assessment. The truth of the matter is the film frames it as more of an odd couple romance. Humbert is rarely, if ever, viewed as a bad guy. The entire intro of the book is completely omitted. No Dr. John Ray Jr., no mention of Annabelle or his first marriage or his times in and out of sanitarium. Indeed, this adaptation ignores everything that lets you know Humbert may not be what he seems. Charlotte is framed as a nag. Lolita, while not quite framed as the maliciously aware siren, is certainly framed as a consenting party to the situation. And Claire Quilty, a character from the book I didn't cover in the summary, but suffice it to say, is the only character in the novel more monstrous than Humbert, is played by Peter Sellers, who gives a legitimately really well done and funny performance that not for a single frame feels like it's actually part of this film at all. As an adaptation goes, it's not good. As a film on its own, it's problematically okay, I guess. The film also brought about the moral conundrum for the first time of how to cast Dolores Hayes / Lolita. How do you ethically find someone to play a 12-year-old target of a child molester? Well, in this case, the character was aged up to 14. And they had her played by then 14-year-old actress Sue Lyons, who was made to look 17. I hope this should go without saying, but aging the character up a bit, okay. But don't make a younger play older. It just feeds into the narrative of, well, she looked 18. Stick with the tried and true Hollywood tradition of making older actors play younger. Also, fun fact, while Nabokov was credited with the screenplay and even nominated for an Academy Award, hardly any, if any, of the finished script was his. Though he wrote 2 drafts, they were thrown out and rewritten by Kubrick and his producer, James B. Harris, a name that we'll be swinging back to later. And it should be noted that Kubrick has many strengths. Writing women characters is just plainly not one of them. The advertising for the film also brought us the classic image of Sue Lyons as Lolita, looking over heart-shaped sunglasses and seductively licking a lollipop. An image that, ironically, is not in the movie, but arguably cemented the cultural zeitgeist of Lolita as the notorious jailbait archetype that we know her as today. Nowhere is the scene more than in the 97 Lolita film adaptation by Adrian Lyne, director of Indecent Proposal, Fatal Attraction in 9.5 Weeks. If I may, I'll now give you a personal review of the film. Look, I watch a lot of gross stuff for this podcast, and for my personal pleasure. I'm not bragging, it's just how it is, but goddamn does this film give me the ick. This time, the audience is informed of Annabelle Lee, no mention of Dr. Ray or the rest that frames Humbert as an unreliable narrator and generally bad dude. Again, the title character, this time portrayed by Dominique Swain, is 14 when Swain herself was 15. Though this version is decidedly not a comedy. It is in fact a love story between a minor and a handsome middle-aged author. While Stanley Kubrick's Lolita may miss the point, this film completely dives into Humbert as a tragic romantic hero. Every shot of Lolita is framed in a way to sexualize her in the most soft-focused of 80s softcore ways. Every act of affection between the two, from their passionate open-mouthed kissing to her sitting in his lap and grinding him until they both come, is partnered with these lush, sweeping strings in the score. Now, it should be noted that a 19-year-old body double was used for the nudity, and an out-of-frame pillow was placed between the two for their more sexual scenes. But nothing is ever offered up cinematically that does anything but condone Humbert's behavior. This film is full out sympathetic to him. And if you need any more proof that Lyne did not treat this film as if he were aware that sexually taking advantage of people was a bad thing, look no further than the fact that Frank Langella, the actor who played Quilty, discovered after the fact that Adrian Lyne had kept 2 shots of his penis in the movie that he never consented to, a fact that still embarrasses him to this day. So, Adrian Lyne, not exactly the greatest dude, or best equipped to tell the actual story of Lolita. Look, I know I've been harping on it at this point, but here's a list of takeaways from Nabokov's novel that have tended to be missed in the adaptations that followed. At the end of the day, A, and I can't stress this enough, Humbert Humbert is an unrepentant bad man child rapist. B, Charlotte Hayes is a flawed mother who is taken advantage of at her most vulnerable. And C, Dolores is a smart young woman who meets a tragic fate. You remember that Hannibal Lecter example from the beginning of the show? I think maybe a more accurate comparison may be Ted Bundy. As a society, we have created this idea of this handsome, cunning mastermind with his uncontrollable darkness inside him. Oh, so suave. Now, even if all that were true, murder is still obviously wrong. But secondly, it's not like he's all that handsome. Like, he's okay, but he's no Taye Diggs. His smile doesn't melt my soul. He was no mastermind, just willing to do horrendous things. And sometimes, well, more than sometimes, cops are bad at doing their jobs. And as for the uncontrolled darkness, this idea that it was pornography that twisted his brain, that was all made up by him. That's some shit that a shyster made up in a last-ditch effort to appear the victim before he died. I mean, really, when did we start trusting serial killers about why they are so misunderstood? And so too with Humbert Humbert, just a monster with a shallow charisma. You know, according to our old friend, Dr. John Ray, PhD, about 12% of the adult male population may share in Humbert Humbert's particular condition. Now, there are numerous reasons why that number may not be the most accurate. At the top of that list is probably that Dr. John Ray, PhD, is a completely made-up individual who states that fact in a work of fiction. Now, I don't claim to know the amount of adult men that participate in child sexual assault. But if the Me Too movement taught us anything, the amount of women who have been affected by the grown men who do CSA is astronomical. Remember Sue Lyon, the young woman that originally brought Dolores Lolita Hayes to the silver screen? It has recently come to light that producer and co-writer of the film, James B. Harris, had sex with her either during the production of the movie or on the press tour thereafter. That puts her at 14, maybe 15, and he was 18 years older than her. There's a name for that, and that name is rape, child rape. This is what real child grooming looks like, and it has nothing to do with what bathroom someone uses or the art of drag. And if you're looking for a misunderstood protagonist who takes a hard look at the sometimes sloppy nature of actual morality, Humbert Humbert just ain't your dude. Try reading Native Son or Grendel. I'm not saying don't read Lolita. In fact, I think you should. It's a classic for a reason. Just be careful that you don't start having too much sympathy for the devil, as it were. While the actual number may not be 12%, it's well above zero, and that's a problem. Final fun fact. I'll miss you, friends. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time on the Band Media Podcast. Oh, there goes that music again. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Band Media Podcast. Email us at bandmediapodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Ronnie Ursenbach. And please like, comment, subscribe. And if you donate blood, come join our Band Media Podcast team on the Red Cross app. And if you don't donate blood, then think about starting and then do the thing I just said. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.